Well, let's talk about the Sermon on the Mount, Richard. How do you approach that? Because I've heard different people say different things about what exactly this represents in terms of, is it a sort of a useful collection of Jesus's teachings and these things that would have been committed to memory in a sort of, systematic way by his followers. I don't know what your take on it is.
I mean, I think it's a compilation of sayings of Jesus made by the evangelist. I mean, I don't think I've ever thought Jesus stood up and said the Sermon on the Mount like that. Actually, I was once present where somebody, as it were, performed the Sermon on the Mount. And it's very interesting because you find it just doesn't work if you try and perform it. It's far too concentrated. It's all these little sayings which mean a lot, and they come thick and fast, one after the other. You can't follow it.
In that sense, it's one of the worst sermons ever preached, because it doesn't have a beginning, middle, and end in the way.
And you see, what was remembered of the sayings of Jesus were these short sayings, a long parable like the parable of the Good Samaritan. Those long parables are about the most that people would remember. What people remembered were these. I think what Jesus deliberately did was to encapsulate his teaching in these pithy sayings and parables. And he didn't fill an hour with one after another of them. They're the kind of bits that you're supposed to take away, the way of remembering it. So I don't think we have in the Gospels anything like a reproduction of an hour's sermon by Jesus. We have these pithy encapsulations of his teaching, which people deliberately committed to memory.
And and so in that sense, that was where the memorization took place. That they weren't attempting to, it wasn't like someone set a tape recorder going and just reproduced everything that Jesus said in that sense. So it sounds like you're somewhat in agreement with Richard on this point.
Well, I'm glad to hear. I mean, Richard's saying that Jesus did not deliver the Sermon on the Mount, and I'm glad to hear him say that, because that's what I think, and so we're agreed on that.
Well, but I suppose the question is, did he say the things that are nevertheless recorded in the Sermon on the Mount? Well, he might have said some.
I think he probably did say some of them, yes, and I think you have to go case by case to do an analysis, which is what people like Richard and I do. We go through each line to see, is this plausibly something that Jesus said? But I think that the problem is that many New Testament scholars have such kind of narrow vision. And so they ask, is Matthew 6:33 something Jesus said? Well, that's fine. You do need to ask that. But what about Thomas 1:14? It's clear Christians are making up stories about Jesus, and they're making up sayings of Jesus. Nobody doubts that. I mean, Richard certainly doesn't doubt that. Gospel of Thomas 1:14 has a very pithy saying of Jesus. Every woman who makes herself a male shall enter into the kingdom of heaven. Well, is that something that Jesus really said? Probably not. It's a pithy saying. It's in an early source. Did somebody memorize Jesus saying that? Well, no, probably not. Probably somebody made up that saying. And so the question's not whether Christians were making up sayings of Jesus or making up sermons of Jesus. They certainly were making up both sayings and sermons. The question is, how do you know in a particular case that this is something Jesus really said or not?
Richard?
Well, I actually think, the attempt to take an individual saying like that, which is what scholars have been trying to do, since form criticism, because form criticism gave us the situation where all we can do is assess each saying individually because, they're sort of independent traditions. And I don't think you can do it. I agree with Bart about that saying in Thomas, but why do we think that? Because it appears to be Jesus saying something very different from anything in earlier records of Jesus' sayings, I suppose. I mean, there are other sayings in Thomas which are not in our Gospels, which are quite sort of coherent with what we have in our Gospels, and maybe Jesus did say them. But how on earth do we tell? It's extremely difficult to assess a single saying. Can
I just respond to that?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just I got 2 points about it. One is that Richard, I thought you were bringing up the point of individual sayings, because I said that Jesus couldn't have delivered the Sermon on the Mount the way it's given, and you said that it's the individual sayings that he said.
Yes.
And so my question is, which are the individual sayings that he said? And now you're saying you can't decide that. So if he didn't deliver the Sermon on the Mount and you can't decide on the individual sayings, I don't really know what you're left with.
No. What I think is that what we can do as historians is make general judgments about the reliability of a source. And we may decide that Matthew's a pretty good source of remembering the teaching of Jesus. And we just have to go with that. We can't we can't say, well, most of the time he's okay, but this particular one really doesn't look authentic. I mean, I don't think
that's really kind of the point, is that in your book what you argue is that the eyewitness were guarantors of the tradition.
Yes.
And so it sounds like what you want to argue is that they guarantee that the tradition is accurate. But now you're saying that the Sermon on the Mount is not something that Jesus delivered, and that we can't decide on individual sayings. And so I don't see in what sense these eyewitness reports are guarantors of the tradition.
Well, I never meant to say that they guaranteed that Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount. It never occurred to me that Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount, actually. I think it's very obviously a device of the writer of the Gospel to collect Jesus' teaching and to make a useful collection of stuff. Just as, Mark has a whole series of Jesus' miracles. They didn't necessarily happen, one after the other on that day. He's just collected them in order to present them to his readers.